The gate, as it turned out, was already bent into pieces of twisted metal when we arrived. The earthquake had really done a number on the CAPRA's HQ. Most of the pavement out front had been split into shards, and the roof of the compound seemed to have caved in on one side, making the building look like a large creature trying to loop its way out of the lake. Still, there were lights on in the windows. Someone had apparently thought ahead and built a backup generator. "Look," the inspector said, pointing to my windshield. A narrow structure stood on the roof's highest point, sort of like a tiny radio tower. A single red beam issued from the tip and ran all the way up to the rip above. I picked up the walkie and radio Marconi's cruiser. "You see this?" "I think we found our guy," she crackled back. We parked our cars under the cover of the trees and approached the entrance, weapons drawn. The forest was dark, but the purple glow of the rift revealed the outline of two armed men standing by the mangled remains of the gate. Marconi signaled to me and we circled around them, keeping our pistols raised. They hadn't seen us yet. For once in my goddamn life, the element of surprise was on our side. "Hey!" one of them shouted, and both lifted their assault rifles. The inspector appeared on the road in front of them. His eyes were burning like dots of cold fire, and his coat whipped behind him in a sudden gust of wind. The guards prepared to fire, but Marconi and I leapt out of the tree line and got them each in a headlock, making them sputter. One of them pulled the trigger and sent a volley of bullets into the air that missed the inspector by miles. It took a bit of flailing, but eventually the men went quiet, their eyes rolling back in their heads. Marconi and I dragged them into the forest and stuffed them behind a fallen log. "Do you think anybody inside heard the gunfire?" she asked me. "Probably," I said. "We'd better move fast." The inspector had already strolled over to the tangled gate and was approaching the front doors. I noticed a tiny camera on the roof swivel in its perch and followed his movements. Angry blood rushed through me, and I placed a bullet in the center of the lens. The camera whipped around with a spray of shattered glass. "They've got eyes on us," I said. "Move! Move!" The inspector lifted a hand and the doors crumpled inward like they'd been turned to cardboard. Another gesture and they blasted across the inside of the lobby. They stuck the Golden Sea in climate with a clang that echoed throughout the room. The ensuing crash as they fell to the floor was loud enough to wake the dead. "Yeah, well, if they didn't know we were coming, they know now," Marconi muttered to me. We followed the inspector indoors. Sure enough, a keen alarm split our eardrums as soon as we crossed the threshold. Red warning lights flashed across the walls. I could hear the sounds of distant yelling and the clumping of heavy boots. "Into the lab," I said. "We gotta find Capel." "To get her to close the rift?" Marconi asked. I stared down at the pistol in my hand. The metal felt cold under my fingers. "Yeah," I said. "Something like that." Footsteps were approaching, so we ducked down onto the same hallways as before and hurried past the locked laboratory doors. The water had washed away, but the aquarium was still empty. Yellow caution tape stretched across the gap in the glass. At one point, we had to stop abruptly and dart down another hall as a swarm of armed guards ran past. The inspector waited for them to disappear, then gestured for us to follow. I wasn't sure how we were going to find Valentina exactly, but I heard a familiar breathy laugh, and I skidded to a halt outside another laboratory door. The sign on the front read Quantum Particle Research Lab. Behind the door, a crowd of happy voices laughed and cheered and applauded as somebody gave a victory speech. My blood began to boil. These scientists didn't care that my son had died. They had made a major breakthrough, and that was all that mattered. Someone popped the goddamn champagne. I kicked open the door. The scientist standing at the nearest desk looked up at me, surprised, but I didn't give them the time to shout for help. I raised my pistol and I squeezed the trigger. The powder lit, the bullet rocketed out of the chamber, and the man's head whipped backwards. A puckered red hole appeared in the center of his forehead. He seemed to sway, his lab coat billowing out before his whole body just went limp and collapsed on the floor. Blood pooled, slow and sticky on the tiles. Someone at the back of the room let out a cry of outrage, but the cry turned to a barbled sputter when I turned and planted another bullet in their throat. Chaos erupted. There was a flurry of white lab coats as the scientists ducked behind desks, tables, chairs, wherever they could find cover. I strode around the room and picked them off one by one. They cowered, they screamed, they held up their hands in pitiful protest. But I ignored their pleas. I could feel something dark surging inside of me, something not altogether alien, and I didn't fight it. I let the cold anger fill my veins. There was a ringing in my ears, and it wasn't until I felt a sharp tugging on my arm that I realized Marconi was screaming my name. I continued to unload my gun into the corpses at my feet until the barrel clicked. I was firing empty air. I kept pulling the trigger until a sharp blow on my cheek knocked me against the wall. Marconi had slugged me in the face. "Jesus, Hannigan!" she screamed. "Are you a cop? Are you a psychopath?" I dabbed at the blood on my lip, my finger coming away a vivid red. For a second, Marconi's words started to sink in, and then I heard a clatter from behind me. Then I turned to see another figure in a lab coat, slipping out the door, their long blonde ponytail whipping behind her. "Capel!" I seethed. I dodged around Marconi and chased the fleeing scientist, who had just enough of a head start. I fumbled for extra ammo as I ran, slipping it clumsily into the gun. Then I fired 3 shots at Valentina's retreating back. All 3 missed, but the last one was only by inches. I saw it rip through the folds of her lab coat before she ducked towards another corner and disappeared. I followed her down another hallway, just in time to see a door closing about halfway down the corridor. My shoes pounded on the tiles as I ran over to it and yanked it open. It was the same room where she'd taken me the last time I was here, or at least it looked awfully similar. All the little details were the same, down to the glass beakers and the microscopes, and the large shape in the corner hidden underneath a gray blanket. Valentina spun around as she heard me enter. I fired another shot into the wall above her head. She ducked down and huddled against the blanketed shape, her tablet clutched in one palmed hand. "Call for help and I'll put a bullet in your brain," I said. "Now put the device down and slide it over to me." Valentina did, slowly, keeping her other hand raised. She pushed the tablet across the tiles. I lifted my leg and stomped on the transparent screen. The glass crunched and shattered as I drove my boot into the floor, leaving little piles of glassy dust. She hesitated. A daughter," she said at last. "Vanessa. She left the Glade at 18 and went to study physics in Chicago. No idea where she went from there. I haven't heard from her in years." "This morning I had 2 sons," I said. "Now I only have 1. Your little earthquake knocked down our house and bashed his head open." Valentina didn't say a word, which saved her life. If she'd offered some insincere apology or started yammering about collateral damage and the greater good, I'd have plugged her between the eyes. She stared up at me, inscrutable as ever behind her glasses, her hands still lifted in tense surrender, tightened my grip on my gun. "You're thinking I'm going to go on some revenge crusade?" I said. "I'm going to track down your daughter and make you feel what it's like to lose a kid? But you got it all wrong. I'm not going to kill Vanessa. You did that yourself the second you opened that rift and let it in that Leviathan." I curled my finger around the trigger. "Thanks to you, we're all going to die. If you happen to die sooner rather than later, well, it's no skin off my back." There was a click as a gun cocked somewhere behind me. I turned my head slightly to see Marconi standing there, her pistol raised and pointed straight at my back. The inspector hovered behind her. His expression was flat, but there was something disapproving in his eyes. I laughed. "You gonna shoot me, Sheriff?" I said. "A giant space wheel's about to eat the entire world. You think a couple more dead bodies is gonna make a damn bit of difference?" "I don't care if the world is ending," she said in a surprisedly quiet voice. "Drop your gun, Hannigan." I looked at the cowering scientist with loathing. "Give me a reason why I should let her live." "Because we need her," Marconi said. "And because this isn't you, Hannigan. I know you. You're a stubborn son of a bitch, but you're not a killer. You're letting yourself be controlled by grief and anger, and when you finally cool down, you're gonna see that. Now drop your gun." "I'd listen to her, Mark," the inspector said in a low voice. My finger twitched on the trigger. It would be so easy to just squeeze the damn thing and send her brains splattering against the wall. The strangest feeling of deja vu came over me. I'd been here before, somewhere like here. That dark anger surging inside me, but I gritted my teeth trying to swallow it down. With immense effort, I reached out and I placed my gun on the counter beside me. The inspector darted forward and grabbed it. My heart was thudding like a jackhammer, and I could barely look at Valentina without seeing red. "Make yourself useful, then," he said shakily. "Close the hole in the sky." Valentina jumped up at once and yanked at the massive gray blanket. It slid off the circular shape and hit the floor with a thump. Underneath was a large control panel with a mirror-like object jutting from the top. Inside the frame, reflected, was a strange metallic surface. I could see a reddish bird's-eye view of the rift. Even on the screen, the sight of the void sent a dull thrumming through my brain. Valentina's fingers danced across the panel, pressing the buttons at speeds I couldn't even begin to follow. Window after window popped up, asking for confirmation, authorization, password, finger recognition. Valentina bypassed them all, with the dexterity of someone who worked with a computer all her life. Eventually, the device began to dim. The red light faded, and the beam retracted from the rift. We stood and we watched, waiting for the rift to seal. But the seconds passed, and the gash in the sky remained as stark and as present as ever. I I don't understand, Valentina said with a trace of panic. The splicer's powered down. I swear, I don't know why the rift is still open. Turning the device off won't work, the inspector said. That beam is like a butter knife sawing at human skin. Scrape at it enough and yes, you'll break through, but if you remove the knife, it doesn't heal the wound. It just stops the sawing. Marconi and I exchanged an uneasy look. So how do we close it? She asked. Same way you would close a deep wound, the inspector said. You cauterize it. If we could channel enough energy, we might be able to seal the rift, but it would require an immense amount of explosive force and... He paused. It would have to be done from the other side. Throwing energy at the rift from down here would only make it bigger. So we're going to need some sort of bomb, I mused. And a way to get inside the rift. I paused. The inspector and I looked at each other and... Bam. Pieces fell right into place. For a moment I forgot about my rage towards Valentina. Helicopter, I said. Just as the inspector said, the explosives. Excuse me? Marconi said. Is somebody going to tell me what's going on here? She lowered her gun, that usual disgruntled tone coming into her voice. Right here in the facility, we have a source of energy and a way to move it, the inspector said. But we have to move quickly. There's no telling how close the Leviathan may have gotten by now. I grabbed Valentina by the arm. She made a brief effort to wiggle away, then gave up, and marched her out of the lab. The inspector swooped by me and glided down the hall as if he knew exactly where we were going. Marconi eyed me skeptically. She followed me as I led Valentina after the inspector and into the heart of the CAPRA. I kept expecting guards to show up and open fire, but the halls were eerily empty and no one disturbed us as we made our way down the corridor. When we finally reached our destination, I let Valentina go and pushed her towards the door. There was a keypad, an eye scanner on the other side, that hadn't been there the last time we'd broken in. Valentina tapped the code, scanned her eyeball, and opened the door. We found ourselves staring at the same big blocky letters from before. Caution. Explosives. We stepped inside, drifting carefully along the cartons. Marconi whistled. The boxes stretched off into the dark corners of the room, each emblazoned with that same black writing. There's hundreds of sticks of dynamite in each container, Valentina said. And this is special stuff. One stick alone could destroy an entire city block. She eyed the inspector warily, said. Does that provide the amount of energy you need? And then some, the inspector muttered. I bent down and peered between the cracks in the closed box, making out a stack of chalky red tubes. I withdrew quickly and took a hasty step back. Why does CAPRA need so many explosives anyway? She stared into the sea of boxes. Backup plan, she said. In case things go wrong. Like now? Marconi asked. Valentina nodded. Like now. She reassured us the containers were safe to move, so we reluctantly got to work, dragging them out of the storage. The inspector lifted a few boxes like they were made of tissue paper, but I was barely able to lug one of them on my own. Marconi and Valentina grabbed one each, and together, we followed the inspector out into the hall. He seemed to remember the way better than I did, so I let him lead us through the winding passages. The doors flew open at his approach, as if they'd been triggered by motion sensors. It didn't take long for us to find the door leading to the helipad. The helicopter sat there, all sleek and black finish, its massive blades hovering like dragonfly wings at rest. I was beginning to think that we were actually going to get away with this, when the clomping footsteps of guards echoed around the corner. Freeze! A voice barked from behind us. The inspector didn't even turn around. He swung his hand back, and suddenly, a wall of stone sprouted from the floor to the corridor, thudding into the ceiling. Another swarm came barreling around the corner, but the inspector waved his hand and sent a second wave shooting upward. There was a chorus of gunfire as guards unloaded on the inspector's makeshift barriers. I tightened my grip around the box and hurried towards the helipad. We're surrounded, I panted. How the hell are we going to get out of here? One step at a time, Hannigan, Marconi said. Let's close that rift before we worry about anything else. We burst into the cool morning air, and we were immediately hit by a blast of wind from above. The Leviathan had stirred the void, sending ripples through the sky. Every step we took was on rumbling ground. We lugged our boxes to the helicopter as carefully as we dared and deposited them in the back. When Valentina placed down hers, she reached inside and went through a long, snaky fuse. She placed it on the floor of the cockpit and backed away gingerly. I'm not sure you thought this through, Valentina said once we'd all gotten clear of the explosives. We can't just fly this thing via remote control. Somebody's going to have to be on the inside to light the fuse. You wanted to see behind the rift, didn't you, Dr. Capel? I said. Well, congrats. Here's your chance. What? She said, startled. You're going to take the helicopter. and you're gonna fly it up into that tear, I said. It'll be easy. Autopilot will take care of the tough stuff. Then, once you get inside, you're gonna light that fuse and blow this baby to kingdom come. Boom. One big explosion, and the rift will be sealed. For a second, I thought that Valentina was about to run. She must have realized she wouldn't have gotten far. A strange heaviness came over her face. She turned her eyes up to the rift where the Leviathan was letting out another great yawn in the distance. The ground rumbled again, a few seconds longer than last time. I suppose I don't have much of a choice, she said. This is really it, isn't it? If I don't go up there and detonate enough energy to close the rift, we're doomed. We're all doomed. There was a rustle as the inspector stepped forward. His fedora was tilted up, revealing those piercing purple eyes, smoke from a cigar, curling in lilac spirals. I came to Pacific Glade to serve humanity, he said to Valentina. As did you, in your own way. Everything you did in the name of progress, of understanding. You wanted to know more so you could do more, so you could improve the human experience, but your curiosity pushed you too far. And that being up there, he gestured with his slender finger, that great hungry beast will undo all the hard work you've ever done. Your life will have amounted to nothing. But if you do this, your life will mean everything. You will single-handedly save the human race. All that work you put in to make the world a better place, safer place. That work goes on. Isn't that what matters? Valentina looked at him, then at Marconi, and then at me. The wind grabbed her hair and sent it billowing around her face. I stared into her eyes and wondered what she was thinking. She didn't say a word, she only nodded. The ground gave another rumble, and she began walking towards the cockpit. The three of us watched as Valentina climbed aboard and headed for the dashboard. She stared at the controls for a moment, and took a seat and flicked a switch. The blades whipped to life, picking up speed until they were a circular gray blur. Then the helicopter began to rise. Guards pounded against the wall, somewhere in the distance, but I could barely hear them over the whir of the blades and the animal roar of the engine. The inspector, Marconi, and I stood and watched as the last hope of humanity lifted off the helipad. The wind whipped around us and blew pebbles into my face, and for a moment I actually dared to believe this crazy idea would work. But as the helicopter swung around, giving me one last look at Valentina's face, a worrying sensation twisted my gut. Something was wrong. It was the gleam in her eye, the tint of a smirk. The tiniest of smirks, not at all the expression of someone embarking on a suicide mission, and I knew, in a split second, that Valentina had no intention of flying up into that rift. She was taking the helicopter full of explosives and piloting it far, far away from here, probably to find her daughter one last time. She was going to leave the whole world to be devoured. I acted before I could stop myself, bounding forward and leapt off the rubbery surface and the helipad and heaving myself into the cockpit. Marconi's cry alerted Valentina, who glanced back at me, taking off. I took advantage of her confusion and scrambled to my feet and charged her. She reached into her lab coat, probably to draw some unseen weapon, but I grabbed her skull and bashed it against the dashboard. Her hand fell. She dropped to the floor. The helicopter started to tilt, so I lifted the cycle stick and yanked it back. The cockpit steadied and righted itself. I hadn't flown since those long-ago days with Peter, but the instincts came rushing back and I settled into the controls with a surprised sense of ease. We were still rising. I took a seat and I adjusted the collective lever and increased our ascent. Valentina was slumped against the side of the cockpit, apparently unconscious. I let myself look down. Marconi had a stunned expression on her face, like someone had wound back and punched her in the chest, but I could barely see her from here. Her body was shrinking beneath the shadow of the helicopter. The inspector stared up at me from beside her. His eyes were hidden beneath the shade of his fedora, and his mouth was drawn in an expressionless line. But there was something solemn about his cigar smoke. It was a dark, billowing maroon, and it floated up after me, like a hand, waving goodbye. I swallowed, and I forced myself to look away. We were getting closer to the rift now, purple light spilling from the gash in the sky. I scanned the control panel and I pressed a promise-looking button. 2 reinforced doors slid shut on both sides of the helicopter, muting all sound from outside and sealing us in the cockpit. My heart thudded as we rose higher, and then a sudden shudder, a tearing sound, like somebody ripping a piece of paper. And we were past the barrier. The world outside the windshields turned into a mind-splitting void, and I heard a creak as the glass adjusted to the sudden vacuum. If it shattered, then we were doomed. But the windshield held. My migraine lessened, and I was able to stare out into the nothingness. Except it wasn't total nothingness. The Leviathan filled most of the void above us, its mouth gradually opening like a whale preparing to inhale krill. This close, I saw that its body extended farther than I originally thought. It rippled back into the abyss, huge yet snake-like. Its tail drifted lazily through the starless sky. The sheer size of it sent a tremble through my body. What chance did we stand against this thing? If we didn't seal this rift, I had no doubt those jaws could open wide and swallow the entire world. The air behind me seemed to contract. And when I dared to look back, I saw a familiar starfish shape folding into existence. Its solid red eye open wide and its tentacles curled up onto the ends like tiny muscles flexing. Hello, Purple Man. I've come to end. The hell is that thing? Valentina shrieked. I hadn't realized she'd woken up. While I'd been distracted by the Leviathan, she crawled towards the pile of explosives and pulled a tiny blaster out of the folds of her coat. She aimed it at the ender with shaky hands. I felt a surge of fear rush through me. Don't! I shouted. If you break the windshield, we're done for! Valentina ignored me and fired a single shot. It was a spark of brilliant light, like the atom blaster in a miniature, and I had no doubt it would vaporize the glass in a heartbeat. But it had been a good shot. The light bullet struck the ender dead on and sent a splatter of black liquid across the cockpit. The creature didn't fall through, and when it turned to face Valentina, I could see a livid vein popping across its starfish skin. Purple bitches dare to attack. I, the ender, oh no. This will not do. The beastie moved faster than I thought it would, flinging itself on Valentina's face and wrapping its tentacles around her head. She shrieked, and for a second, I was afraid that she'd let off another shot and kill us all, but the blaster fell from her hand and clattered across the floor. She flailed for a bit, then went quiet, as if the ender had injected her with some sort of sedative. A horrible gnashing filled the air, like the set of sharp teeth grinding together, and a sudden spurt of blood splashed across the doors. I nearly screamed myself as the ender gnawed at Valentina's neck, its blood inflating in and out like a pufferfish. She didn't make a noise as it drained her dry. Then it turned to face me, blood dripping from its tentacles, leaving Valentina's pale corpse behind it. I'd like to say my last thoughts were about Ruth, or Rory, or Stephen. I'd like to say that my whole life flashed before my eyes. And that's what happens in the movies, right? The hero gets one moment of peace before the big finale. But I was no hero. And sure, I'd saved a few folks. Stopped plenty more from dying painful deaths, but a lot of that boiled down to the inspector. He was the real hero here. The truth was, the Neverglades needed him a hell of a lot more than it needed me. At least I could go out saving the people I loved. In the end, all I thought was, I hope this doesn't hurt. The ender's sticky tentacles slapped against my face, and I could feel its sucker sinking into my skin. I fought the incoming wave of wooziness and pulled my lighter out of my pocket. For a second, I was afraid it wouldn't light up here, but the helicopter was airtight, and the little flame burst into life. I leaned down and touched it gently to the fuse. Thin ropes burned away. The spark crawled across the ground towards the pile of boxes. I looked away and stared into the maw of the Leviathan. Those great jaws were open wide now, so impossibly wide that they blocked out all view of the void. Tiny specks glimmered inside the creature's cosmic gullet. Despite the hissing of the fuse, despite the sucker digging into my skull, I found myself smiling. What do you know? I said. It's full of stars. The ender's teeth suddenly stabbed into my neck, and it hurt. It hurt, all right. Oh, God, did it hurt. I staggered against the window and left a spatter of blood on the glass. That starfish bit like a mini shark. I could feel my consciousness draining, but I forced my eyes open and stared blearily out of the cockpit. I stumbled forward until I was practically slumped against the control panels. The fuse behind me went quiet, and in that fraction of a second, the world turned into a kaleidoscope. I gazed into the Leviathan's glittering universe, and I thought I saw a tiny speck of purple amid all those stars. The cockpit was as silent as the glade on a cold winter night. And then, the explosives lit. Fire blossomed around me. And I was gone. Picture, if you will, a quiet day in the Neverglades. The morning sun floats behind a thick cover of clouds, barely visible as a disk of glowing light. What little light it spreads washes over mountains, forests, roads that cut through stretches of country, broken by wandering animals and the occasional rundown house. Follow the roads, and no matter what the direction, you'll find yourself winding back into town. Folks with beat-up jeeps journeying to the supermarket. Mothers push strollers down overgrown sidewalk. Policemen sit in windowless offices and imagine the world outside. A single siren might cut through the air, under the distant crashing of a waterfall. Everything smells of pine, and the dampness that follows each rainfall. On this day, like so many others, the glade is defined by absence. Empty desks at work, empty chairs at home, empty tables in the diner. Some of the missing are at the hospital just outside of town. They suffered injuries in the Great Quake, but they'll be back to the grind before long. The others are never coming back. Swoop down from your bird's eye view down to the center of town and peer into the window of the Hanscombe house. Vera Hanscombe. She stands at the kitchen table in a faded apron, trying to dole out oatmeal to a pair of whining children. Her hair falls loose in a sweaty strand across her forehead. There are 2 empty chairs at her table, one for a grown man, another for a small infant. Neither will sit there anymore. In a matter of months, Vera has gone from a bustling housewife to a single mother of 2. She sits through a breakfast of complaints and arguments, then excuses herself to wash the dishes. The suds are hot and they scald her hand as she works. She stares out the window at the pale morning sun and waits for the children to leave for the school bus. Then she dries her hands on a dish rag and heads upstairs. Her house survived the quake unscathed, but there is one room on the 2nd floor that might as well be quarantined. Nobody dares to go inside. Some days Vera can't help herself, though. Today is one of those days. She opens the door, she slips inside and closes it quietly behind her, as if afraid to wake whoever sleeps here. But no one sleeps here anymore. There is a rickety wooden crib in the corner, surrounded by blocks and toys and an assortment of stuffed animals that Vera can't bring herself to pack away. She approaches the crib and rocks it gently. There's still a small dent in the blanket, as if a ghostly child lies there, asleep and dreaming. Vera doesn't speak or sing or do anything but rock the crib. She wishes she had never hit that poor old man with her car. Her life, already hard enough, had been nothing but misery since then. She closes her eyes and kisses the headboard and wishes to go back to before everything changed. In that regard, she is not alone. Enough. Let's leave her some privacy. Turn away from her window and continue down the street of town, past the collapsed remains of Vivian Tracy's house, past the shuddering repair shop of the late Mike Schneider, past a cottage on the forest edge where a forgotten woman used to live. There's life on these streets, yes, but everywhere you go, there are also vacancies, little holes in the bustle that you feel more than you see. The rebuilding has begun in earnest, and in many places life has returned to the normalcy of before the quake. And others, and struggles to remain its standing. Families have been displaced, homes have been reduced to a few standing walls and a pile of rubble. Many find refuge with friends and family in town, others leave town entirely. Pacific Glade is home, but it is a home in ruins, and for many it now holds scars and painful memories. The loyal will stay, but when winter comes, the Glade will be smaller than it has ever been. For now the air is cold, with the crisp wind of a North Pacific summer. Follow the breeze along with those winding roads until you reach the edge of Locklear Cemetery. There is a slow procession, moving through the gravestones today, 2 rows of mourners, clad in black, carrying a pair of coffins. One is empty, the other is barely weighted down by the small body inside. Ruth Hannigan stands at the edge of the pit as the coffin bearer lowers each casket into the ground. She rests her hand on her son Stephen's shoulder. Neither of them moves as the preacher recites the eulogy and describes what wonderful lives the deceased had lived. There are tears and sniffles from the crowd, but Ruth's eyes are dry. They have been dry since the day of the quake. When the ceremony is over and the gravediggers started filling in the holes, Stephen comes forward and places a small object in the dirt around Rory's headstone. It's a collectible action figure, a character from the games they used to enjoy. A drop of water spats on the figure's colored uniform from above. Stephen wipes his eyes, and he leaves the toy beside his brother's grave. The crowd of mourners has dispersed, wandering back to their cars. Olivia Marconi leaves the cluster and approaches Ruth at the gravesite. The sheriff has dressed her best for the somber occasion, crisp blue uniform neatly pressed, with a distinctive curved brim hat. She tips this hat at Ruth as she grows near. "How are you doing?" the sheriff asks quietly. Ruth twists the wedding ring on her finger and says nothing for a minute. "I'm alive," she says at last, which is more than I can say for them. "He was a hero, you know," Marconi says. "He was the one who saved us all in the end. Things would have been much, much worse if he hadn't done what he did." Ruth tries to smile, but it comes out as a grimace. I know, and I'm grateful that Stephen and I are still here. It's just..." She lets her hand fall. You worry. As a wife and a mother, you worry about your family's safety, and I know I'm not to blame for any of this, but I keep thinking, if only I had done something. If only I could have protected them. "It was out of your control," Marconi reassures her. "It was out of everyone's control." Ruth shivers. "I keep waiting for him to show up. Like he's gonna stride in and tell everyone everything's okay. And then he's got Mark hidden under the enormous coat of his. But I haven't seen him since the quake." Marconi says nothing. She glances around the cemetery as if Ruth's words are an invocation that this cloaked figure will magically appear among the tombstones. But no figure does. There's only the retreating backs of the mourners as they disappear, back into the misty morning. "Take as long as you need," Marconi says. "Janine's preparing lunch at the house when you get back. Chopped salad with a raspberry dressing. It won't be long," Ruth says. Her voice is distant. She doesn't look at the sheriff as Marconi walks away. She doesn't look at Stephen when he mutters that he's going to go back and sit in the car. She only nods and tugs at the sleeves of her black dress and stares down at Rory's small casket, at her husband's empty grave. Rain plunks in her skin, first one drop, then another, and the clouds open up and begin to pour. She clutches her arms and shivers, but doesn't seek shelter from the storm. The ground turns to muck beneath her feet, and the gravediggers abandon their project for the day, grumbling under their breath. Ruth stands alone above a pair of rain-soaked coffins. She has held in her pain for so long, but there's no one around, and streams of water are already running down her face, and she can't escape how much this moment feels like the last goodbye. So her veneer breaks, and under this cold summer rain, damp and alone, Ruth Hannigan finally lets herself cry. Let's linger in this place for just a bit longer. The road is a rumble with passing cars and bicycles, but Locklear Cemetery has its own sort of quiet, as if the wind itself knows to whisper here. The hours pass and the graves remain silent and solid. A bird nesting in the shadows of the mausoleum emerges to grab worm after the fresh rainfall. Look, clouds are parting. Setting sun is visible resting on the crest of Mount Palmer, in that curious way that it has. Cast a long shadow. Look closer. You'll see a single figure walking through that shadow, striding down the path between the gravestones. She leaves the path and approaches a pair of graves, swollen with freshly turned earth. A lighter clicks in the dark, and the flame illuminates the face of Olivia Marconi. The sheriff had curbed her urge to smoke for almost a year, but the quake had brought back that craving in full force, and she finally swapped her chewing gum for a pack of cigarettes. She touches the flame to her cigarette, takes a long drag, and she blows a thin cloud of smoke towards the gravestones. "I don't care what happened at the end," she says. "You're a good cop, Hannigan." The smoke swirls and grows, takes on a light purple tinge, and Marconi realizes that most of it's coming from behind her. She turns to see an impossibly tall figure in a trench coat and a gray fedora. The smoke billows from the softly burning cigar, clenched between his teeth. "Inspector?" Marconi says. The inspector tips his hat towards her. "I came to pay my respects." He steps up to join her by the side of the grave. Neither speaks for a very long time. Then Marconi makes a small noise, almost like a sigh. She plucks the cigarette from her mouth and stares into the burning tip. "You can't... I don't know. Bring him back to life?" She peers at the inspector through the settling sunset. "Do you have that kind of mojo?" "If there was a body, maybe," he says. "But it would just be a walking shell. No memories, no thoughts, no motivations. It wouldn't be the Mark you knew." He looks off towards the mountains. "This way is better." Marconi places a cigarette between her lips. Her teeth gnaw on the end. "This isn't over, is it?" "No," the inspector says. "Mark closed a larger rift, but reality is still thin in Pacific Glade, and more entities will get through. And that's not even taking CAPRA into account. I doubt it died with Valentina Capel. These sorts of corporations always have something higher pulling the strings, and they're not going to stop just because of one setback." Marconi blows out another funnel of smoke. "So we get all the eldritch monsters in the multiverse on one side, and a shadowy government organization on the other." She let out a forced laugh. "Sounds like a real walk in the park." "It won't be easy," the inspector says, staring down at the bumps in the soil. "You've seen where the road can end up. I know I may be asking too much, but will you fight with me, Sheriff?" Marconi lowers her cigarette and taps some ash into the grass. "Of course I will." If only they could see what we do. This unusual pair, the two dots of defiant brightness amongst the darkness of the dead. The sun frames them from behind in brilliant orange. In a short while they will leave this place, back to the bustle of town, but for now, they stand in the quiet and mourn their fallen friend. A bright blue bird flutters down and rests on top of Mark's headstone. It tilts its head and it studies the strange duo. Then the smoke drifts towards it. It flies off with a chirp, wings fluttering as it disappears into the orange sky. Here's how it is. Despite the absence, despite the empty chairs, Pacific Glade is still brimming with life. It is a place that glistens with invisible connections. Those threads that connect people to person in the web of communities. Teenagers sneak out of their houses for secret trysts with their sweethearts. Neighbors share gossip with each other at the supermarket. Drivers turn up the radio and listen to Joe and Alan croon over their dirty jokes. The threads stretch and sparkle across town. Everything, everybody is connected. And on some level, they know this. Gladers look out for their own, after all. See for yourself. On the edge of the town, in that yawning dusk, Nico Sanchez pulls up to Abigail Shannon's house and helps her hobble down the front steps. Despite the bulky cast on her leg, and against her doctor's orders, Abigail has already returned to work at the station, spending her whole day working the front desk. She doesn't mind. The night shifts tend to be quiet, and besides, she spends most of it chatting with Nico. They're on a first-name basis now, and their conversation is easy, natural. She likes him. Maybe not on a workplace romance level, but enough to be friends. And sometimes, friendship is perfect. Their cruiser passes Marconi's on the way to work, and they wave through the steam-frosted windows. The setting sun glares in such a way that they miss the shadowy figure in the passenger seat. Slip out of that crack in the window, why don't you? And follow Marconi home. The radio is on. Nature sounds burble through the car's ancient speakers. She likes the white noise, it soothes her, like a warm bath or a cigarette after a 12-hour shift. Her passenger sits silently beside her and stares out of the twilight streets. Janine is already setting the table when Marconi opens the door. Ruth and Stephen, the last of the Hannigans, emerge from upstairs, take their places at the table. The house has become their makeshift residence during the months following the quake. And even though it's not quite the same, even though the bathroom soap is all wrong and there's too many empty beds, They are welcome here. They have a home. In the aftermath of a crisis like theirs, sometimes that's all you can ask for. Marconi places her keys on the hook, then fishes her wedding ring out of the dish on the counter. She slips it on her finger and gives Janine a kiss. Marconi's wife beams, frizz bouncing around her flushed cheeks. "I brought a friend," Marconi says. "I hope that's okay." There's no objections from anyone at the table, so she approaches the front door and lets her visitor in. The inspector ducks through the doorway and rises to his full 7 feet, casting a thin shadow across the tiles. He looks sheepish, out of his element for once, but Ruth invites him to take a seat, and Janine doles out a handful of green beans, and Marconi smiles. She hangs up her coat and she joins her family at the table. Somewhere in the midst of all this, that stubborn sun finally sinks below the mountains. Night brings a closing of doors, as the jeeps pull into the driveway and the mothers tuck their children into the covers. A few stragglers wander through the darkness to the hanging rock now rebuilt, and proceed to get spectacularly drunk. Otherwise, the night belongs to the chattering of unknown animals, the rustle of the pines, and the ever-present rush of distant water. Follow the river, no matter the direction, and eventually you'll spill back into Lake Lucid. Water skimmers dart across the lily pads, fish swim in circles onto the surface. Wind whistles, sending ripples through the reflections of the moon. Now look up. Up past the trees, up past the lurking mountains, up to the circle of bright whiteness hovering in the night sky. It isn't hard to imagine the moon as a wide, gleaming eye in the face of some massive being. An eye staring down at the town, at the forest, at the Neverglades, and marveling at the strange wonders of this quiet little world. Last year, my good friend, Mark Hannigan, gave up his own life to save the lives of his friends, family, and neighbors. Indeed, the entire world as he knew it. As we know it. Mark was perhaps the bravest and humblest man I've ever met. He knew every case could be his last, yet he never wavered, pressing on with that selfless, headstrong attitude I eventually came to admire. Even in the last moment as I watched him ascend into the rift, he didn't hesitate. He was a fighter, to the very end. It's been a year since he left us, and I confess, I haven't handled the anniversary well. I keep wondering if Olivia had been right, if it would have been better to bring Mark back, empty, blank, utterly hollowed out but alive. I knew it would devastate his family. I knew it would open old wounds and set them bleeding afresh, but I was in pain. I was wounded too. And in my pain, I made a hasty decision. I opened the rift, and I began searching for my lost partner. I'll spare you the details of the journey. I am large. I contain multitudes, as one of your eminent poets once said. But even in my vastness, I couldn't find a trace of Mark in all that empty space. The explosion had vaporized his body. If there was anything left of him, it was atoms on the breeze, molecular specks too small to reassemble. My large search ended in vain, with me returning, hand in hand, to the rift between our worlds. That was where I found it. The parasitic being who calls itself the Ender, who feeds on humans beyond the veil, who snuffs out light and brings death to the world next door. And suddenly I was overwhelmed with thought that if the Ender had taken Mark in his death throes, a spark of my friend might still exist. Not his entire essence, no, but I could never be so lucky, but a spark. To make a long story short, I managed to extract what remained of Mark from within the Ender. It's a stubborn beast, but at the end of its day, it knows who it obeys. It looked like a tiny sphere of pulsing light, dripping with black tendrils, and when I gripped it, I could hear his voice. I could see flashes of his memories, glistening and vibrant, and I knew this little orb couldn't bring back his body, but it could keep my friend alive, in the way only the truest of words can. I held that orb, and I recorded his story word for word, exactly as his voice described it to me. They're the stories I've shared with you. You never knew Mark Hannigan, But I hope that through his words, you understand what a remarkable man he was. He wouldn't have wanted me to call him a hero. Maybe he would have found the title corny. Maybe it would have embarrassed him. But you've heard his tale now. You can decide for yourself. There isn't much left of Mark. Taking him from the Ender was like unplugging a machine from a socket, and now he's running out of charge. The orb is smaller than it has ever been. Shreds of light tear from it every so often and disappear. I know that everything, even this much, will be gone. From here on out, he lives through these words, and through all of you. Whatever you do, don't forget him. Don't let that spark go out. I think he's earned that much. Signed, the Inspector.